I never thought my biggest battle would be fought in the quiet suburbs of Texas after surviving 3 tours in Afghanistan. But there I was, watching in horror as Margaret Henderson, our HOA president, and everyone's favorite Karen casually snipped the clear tubing that delivered life-giving oxygen to my 10-year-old daughter's bedroom. HOA revenge stories rarely start with such cruelty, but mine did. My daughter Lily has severe asthma, a condition that worsened after I returned from service with what the doctors call secondary trauma in my child. The portable oxygen concentrator was medically necessary, a fact I had documented and submitted to the HOA board twice before. Margaret claimed it violated the community's exterior medical equipment policy, a rule so vaguely worded it could apply to anything from wheelchair ramps to inhalers. "You have 24 hours to remove this eyesore, Sergeant Michaels," she had said that morning, using my military rank like it was an insult. "Or we'll fine you $500 a day until you comply." I explained again that Lily couldn't breathe without it, especially during the Texas allergy season when pollen counts soared higher than my anxiety levels. I showed her the doctor's orders, the medical exemption forms, even offered to plant screening shrubs around the condenser unit. Nothing mattered to Margaret. Rules were rules, she insisted, while her perfectly manicured nails tapped against her clipboard. When I returned from taking Lily to her pulmonary appointment that afternoon, I found the tubing cut cleanly near the exterior wall. The machine was still running, uselessly pushing oxygen into the disconnected line. Lily was inside, struggling to breathe, her small chest heaving as she tried to draw air through constricted airways. If you're angry right now, comment HOA Karen, because what happened next would test every ounce of self-discipline I had left in my battle-scarred body. 3 years ago, I retired from the Army with a Purple Heart, a PTSD diagnosis, and a determination to give my daughter the stable home she deserved while I healed my own invisible wounds. We settled in Meadowbrook Heights, a master-planned community just outside San Antonio, drawn by the promise of safety, good schools, and the kind of neighborly support that military families crave after years of relocation. The tree-lined streets and manicured lawns seemed like the perfect place for Lily to recover from the anxiety attacks that had plagued her since my last deployment. Lily's medical condition developed gradually after I returned home. Doctors believe it's a combination of genetic predisposition and the stress of having a parent with combat trauma. By the time we moved to Meadowbrook, she required daily medications and occasional oxygen treatments, especially during high pollen seasons or when her anxiety spiked. The portable oxygen concentrator was a compromise less intrusive than the large tanks she'd used before, allowing her to attend school normally and sleep peacefully at night. Our first 6 months in the community were peaceful. I found work as a consultant for a defense contractor, a job that utilized my skills without retriggering my PTSD. Lily made friends, joined the Girl Scouts, and even won the school science fair with her project on native Texas plants. I volunteered for the Neighborhood Watch, helped organize the Veterans Day celebration, and generally tried to be the kind of neighbor I had always wanted during our years of military moves. Margaret Henderson had been friendly enough at first, bringing over a welcome basket and asking about my service. She was everything you'd expect from an HOA president, meticulously dressed, fiercely protective of property values, and armed with a 3-ring binder containing the community's bylaws. Her husband, a retired dentist, rarely spoke at meetings, content to let Margaret run the show with an iron fist disguised in a white glove. The first signs of trouble appeared when I installed a small ramp at our front entrance to accommodate Lily's occasional wheelchair use during severe asthma attacks. Margaret sent a violation notice before the concrete had even cured, citing unapproved structural modifications. I appealed, submitted medical documentation, and finally received approval after appearing before the full board. But the tension had begun, and Margaret's smile never quite reached her eyes again after that. After the ramp incident, Margaret seemed to watch our property with unusual intensity. The violation notices came monthly, first for our flagpole, displaying the American flag, which apparently violated height restrictions. Then for our mailbox, the wrong shade of white. Then for our lawn grass 2 inches too high during the week. I was at a VA hospital for PTSD treatment. Each violation carried a fine. Each appeal required hours of documentation and appearances before the board. Each interaction with Margaret left me feeling like I was back in Afghanistan, navigating hostile territory. The discrimination became more obvious when I observed how other neighbors were treated. The Johnsons across the street had a basketball hoop that clearly violated the no permanent sports equipment rule. yet they never received a single notice. The Millers next door painted their front door a deep blue without approval, something that had earned me a stern warning when I'd asked about repainting our faded front door. When I mentioned these inconsistencies to Margaret, she adjusted her pearl necklace and explained that discretionary enforcement was part of her presidential duties. Lily's condition worsened as the Texas summer intensified. Her pulmonologist recommended continuous oxygen therapy at night, necessitating a more powerful concentrator that had to be installed outdoors due to ventilation requirements. The medical supply company delivered the unit on a Tuesday morning, and by Wednesday afternoon, Margaret was at my door with yet another violation notice. "This industrial equipment cannot be placed where it's visible from the street," she declared, gesturing toward the machine with a look of disgust. "It's bringing down property values and creating an unsightly view." I explained again that this was medical equipment, not an industrial appliance. I showed her the letter from Lily's doctor, the medical necessity forms, even offered to build a decorative screen around the unit. Nothing mattered to Margaret. Rules were rules, she insisted, while her eyes darted around our property as if searching for further violations. The following week, I received a certified letter stating that I had 10 days to remove the oxygen concentrator or face fines of $500 per day, plus legal fees. When I called to request a hearing with the full board, Margaret informed me that she had the authority to make emergency decisions regarding health and safety issues. The irony of her using health and safety to deny my daughter's medical equipment wasn't lost on me. What Margaret didn't count on was my military training in reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. After she cut Lily's oxygen tube, I didn't confront her immediately. Instead, I did what soldiers do best. I gathered information, assessed the situation, and planned my next move carefully. The next morning, I created a private Facebook group for Meadowbrook Heights residents, framing it as a community improvement initiative. Within hours, I had 24 members, and within days, the stories started pouring in. Margaret had been targeting vulnerable residents for years, using her position on the HOA board to bully and intimidate those least likely to fight back. There was Mrs. Garcia, an 82-year-old widow who had been fined 1-0 for planting roses in her front yard without approval. The roses were a memorial to her late husband, a veteran like me. There was the Patel family, who had been threatened with legal action over the religious symbols they displayed during Diwali. Most disturbing was the story of the Robinsons, whose teenage son used a wheelchair. Margaret had demanded they remove their wheelchair ramp, calling it a permanent architectural modification that required a 3-0 application fee and 6 months of approval processes. As I collected these stories, a pattern emerged. Margaret targeted newcomers, families with medical needs, and residents of color. She enforced rules selectively, punishing those she deemed undesirable while overlooking violations from her friends and social circle. The HOA's finances were suspicious too. Annual dues had increased by 40% over 3 years, with vague explanations about community improvements that never materialized. The most damning discovery came from David Chen, a forensic accountant who had recently moved to the neighborhood. He had obtained copies of the HOA's financial records through a public records request and found irregularities in the accounting large payments to a landscaping company owned by Margaret's nephew, questionable consulting fees paid to Margaret herself, and a reserve fund that had been depleted without proper board approval or community notification. Armed with this information, I reached out to a local veterans organization that provided legal assistance to service members. They connected me with a pro bono attorney who specialized in HOA disputes and disability rights law. Together, we began building a case against Margaret and the HOA board, documenting every violation, every discriminatory action, every instance of financial mismanagement. The night after Margaret cut Lily's oxygen tube was the longest of my life. Lily's breathing grew increasingly labored as the Texas humidity thickened the air. I sat by her bed, monitoring her oxygen levels with a fingertip pulse oximeter, watching the numbers drop dangerously low. At 2 a.m., with her oxygen saturation at 87%, I loaded her into the car and rushed her to the emergency room. The doctors were horrified when I explained what had happened. This could be considered assault? The attending physician told me as they stabilized Lily with a portable oxygen tank. Deliberately interfering with a child's medical equipment is not just unethical, it's potentially criminal. Lily spent 2 nights in the hospital, during which I barely slept. My military training had prepared me for combat, for seeing comrades injured, for making life or death decisions under pressure. But nothing had prepared me for the helpless feeling of watching my child struggle to breathe because of someone's petty cruelty. When we returned home, I found a notice taped to our front door. It was an official letter from the HOA signed by Margaret, stating that we were in violation of multiple community standards and subject to immediate fines totaling $500. The letter threatened legal action if the unauthorized medical equipment was not removed within 48 hours. Something inside me snapped. Not in a violent way, my military discipline still held, but in a way that clarified my purpose. I was done trying to reason with Margaret, done appealing to her sense of decency, done following a process that was clearly rigged against us. It was time to fight back. Not just for Lily and me, but for all the residents Margaret had bullied over the years. I called the attorney the Veterans Organization had recommended, then reached out to the neighbors who had shared their stories with me. Within hours, we had organized a meeting at my home. By sunset, my living room was filled with residents who had been victimized by Margaret's regime of selective enforcement and discrimination. As I looked around the room at the diverse group of neighbors, elderly Mrs. Garcia, the Patel family, the Robinsons with their teenage son, David Chen with his financial analysis, and a dozen others, I felt something I hadn't experienced since leaving the military. The power of unity, the strength that comes from people joining together for a common cause. We were no longer isolated victims. We were a community ready to fight for justice. Our first step was to document everything. I created a timeline of every interaction with Margaret, every violation notice, every discriminatory action. Mrs. Robinson provided photographs of her son's wheelchair ramp and the subsequent threatening letters. Mr. Patel had saved every email exchange about their Diwali decorations. David Chen shared his analysis of the HOA's financial records, highlighting the irregularities and potential fraud. The attorney advised us to follow the HOA's own procedures while simultaneously preparing for legal action. This meant formally requesting a special meeting of the full HOA board to address the grievances and present evidence of Margaret's misconduct. According to the bylaws, we needed signatures from 25% of the homeowners to force such a meeting, a threshold we reached within 2 days. As we gathered signatures, something remarkable happened. Neighbors who had previously been afraid to speak up came forward with their own stories of Margaret's bullying tactics. The more people talked, the more we realized how widespread the problem was. Margaret had created an atmosphere of fear and intimidation, using her position to settle personal scores and enforce her vision of what the perfect neighborhood should look like. Our community organizing efforts extended beyond just gathering evidence and signatures. We started a petition calling for Margaret's resignation, which garnered support from over 60% of the homeowners. We created a website documenting the HOA's misconduct and financial irregularities. We even reached out to local media, though we held off on going public until we had exhausted all internal remedies. The most unexpected support came from an unlikely source: Margaret's own neighbors. The Hendersons lived next door to a retired Army colonel who had previously kept to himself. When he learned what Margaret had done to Lily's oxygen tube, he was incensed. "I've served this country for 30 years, he told me over the fence one morning. "I didn't come home to this kind of tyranny in my own neighborhood." The colonel, along with several other respected community members, agreed to speak at the special HOA meeting, lending credibility and authority to our cause. We also recruited a local disability rights advocate and a certified public accountant to review our evidence and provide expert testimony. As the meeting date approached, tensions in the neighborhood escalated. Margaret and her supporters began a counter-campaign, spreading rumors about me and questioning my military service. They sent out mass emails warning of special interest groups trying to destroy our community standards. But their efforts only strengthened our resolve and brought more neighbors to our side. The day of the special HOA meeting arrived with an unseasonable Texas thunderstorm, as if the weather itself reflected the tension in our community. The meeting was scheduled at the community center, a space that had never seen so many residents in attendance. Every chair was filled, and people stood along the walls, spilling out into the hallway. Margaret arrived fashionably late, flanked by her husband and 2 other board members who had consistently supported her decisions. She carried her trademark clipboard and wore a crisp pantsuit, her expression a mixture of defiance and discomfort as she surveyed the crowded room. The meeting began with the standard procedures: roll call, approval of previous minutes, financial report, but the atmosphere was anything but standard. When the floor opened for public comment, I was the first to speak, as the resident who had called the meeting. I kept my remarks brief and factual, outlining the pattern of discriminatory enforcement and financial mismanagement we had documented. I concluded by formally requesting Margaret's resignation and calling for new elections to the HOA board. As I spoke, the room was silent, every eye fixed on me, then on Margaret, whose face grew increasingly flushed. When I finished, the colonel who lived next door to Margaret stood to speak. His military bearing and dignified presence commanded immediate respect. He spoke of his service, his love for his community, and his disappointment in how the HOA had been run. "I did not fight for this country abroad only to come home and witness discrimination against a child with medical needs," he stated, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "What happened to Sergeant Michaels's daughter is unacceptable, un-American, and must not be tolerated." One by one, residents came forward to share their experiences. Mrs. Garcia spoke through tears about her memorial roses. Mr. Patel described the humiliation of being told his religious celebrations were inappropriate for the community. Mr. Sistenso Robinson broke down as she explained how Margaret's demands had affected her son's independence and dignity. David Chen presented his financial analysis with methodical precision, detailing the questionable payments to Margaret's nephew and the unauthorized fees she had awarded herself. The CPA we had brought in confirmed his findings, adding that the financial irregularities could potentially constitute criminal fraud. Margaret and her board members grew increasingly defensive, interrupting speakers, challenging the validity of the evidence, and at one point, threatening to adjourn the meeting. But the residents would not be silenced. When Margaret finally stood to respond, she was met with a chorus of boos and shouts of "resign." As Margaret struggled to maintain control of the meeting, something unexpected happened. The door to the community center opened, and in walked a man in a crisp military uniform. He was a captain from the nearby Army base, where I had done some consulting work. He had heard about what happened to Lily through the Veterans Network and had come to show support. The presence of an active duty military officer changed the dynamic of the meeting immediately. Margaret, who had previously dismissed my military service as irrelevant, now seemed unsure of how to respond. The captain didn't speak, but his mere presence sent a clear message. This community's treatment of a veteran and his child had not gone unnoticed. After the meeting adjourned without Margaret's resignation, she had stormed out, followed by her supporters. The captain approached me. "Sergeant Michaels," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Captain Reynolds. We've met at the base." I recognized him immediately. He had attended several of my training sessions on counterinsurgency tactics. "Captain, thank you for coming," I said, shaking his hand. "I wish I could do more," he replied, "but my hands are tied as far as official involvement goes. However, I did mention your situation to a few people who might be able to help." He didn't elaborate, but I sensed there was more to his visit than moral support. As we talked, several other residents gathered around, thanking the captain for his service and expressing their support for our cause. The following day, I received a call from the base commander's office. They wanted to discuss a community outreach event that might be of interest to our neighborhood. When I arrived for the meeting, I was surprised to find not just base personnel but representatives from several veterans organizations, including some quite high-ranking officials. They explained that they had been following the situation with our HOA and were concerned about the treatment of a veteran with a disabled child. While they couldn't get directly involved in a civil dispute, they could organize a public event that would demonstrate community support for veterans and raise awareness about disability rights. The event they proposed was a Veterans Appreciation Day to be held in our neighborhood park, which would include military displays, educational booths, and, most surprisingly, a flyover by Army helicopters. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. This was their way of showing support without crossing any lines. As I left the meeting, I couldn't help but smile at the thought of Margaret's reaction to Black Hawks flying over her perfectly manicured community. It wasn't the kind of direct confrontation I had initially wanted, but it was a powerful statement nonetheless. The Veterans Appreciation Day event was scheduled for 2 weeks later, giving us time to organize and promote it throughout the community. What started as a show of support for veterans quickly evolved into something much more a celebration of community, unity, and diversity. We invited all residents to participate, regardless of their position on the HOA issues. The Patel family offered to organize a cultural display, highlighting the contributions of immigrant veterans. MrsProtter.com. Garcia volunteered to coordinate a memorial garden for fallen service members, The Robinsons set up a booth on disability rights and accessibility. Even some of Margaret's former supporters, uncomfortable with her increasingly extreme positions, began to distance themselves and join our efforts. The local media picked up the story, framing it as a community coming together in support of a veteran family. The coverage was overwhelmingly positive, highlighting the inclusive nature of our event and the underlying message about standing up against discrimination and bullying. As the event day approached, tensions in the neighborhood reached a fever pitch. Margaret and her remaining supporters tried to block the use of the community park, claiming it violated HOA rules about commercial events and unauthorized gatherings. But they were overruled by the City Parks Department, which had jurisdiction over the space. On the morning of the event, the weather was perfect, clear blue skies and mild temperatures. By mid-morning, the park was filled with residents, veterans, military personnel, and media representatives. Booths lined the pathways, offering information about veteran services, disability rights, and community resources. A stage had been set up for speeches and performances. The highlight of the day was scheduled for 2 p.m., the flyover by Army Black Hawk helicopters from the nearby base. As the time approached, a hush fell over the crowd. Everyone looked to the sky, waiting for the sound of rotors that would signal the helicopter's approach. At precisely 2 p.m., the distinctive thump, thump, thump of helicopter blades could be heard in the distance. The crowd cheered as 3 Black Hawks appeared on the horizon, flying in formation over the neighborhood. They circled the park twice, a powerful display of military precision and support. As the helicopters completed their second pass, something unexpected happened. They didn't fly away, but instead began to descend toward the large open field adjacent to the park. The crowd watched in awe as the massive helicopters landed one by one, their rotors kicking up dust and grass in dramatic swirls. The landing of the Black Hawks was not part of the original plan, but Captain Reynolds had arranged it as a special tribute. As the rotors slowly wound down, the helicopter's doors opened, and soldiers began to emerge. They weren't just any soldiers, they were medics, each carrying medical equipment and supplies. The crowd watched in confusion as the medics approached the stage where I was standing with Lily. Captain Reynolds joined us, taking the microphone to address the assembled residents. "Ladies and gentlemen, veterans and neighbors," he began. "What you're witnessing today is more than just a demonstration of military support. It's a reminder of the values we hold dear as Americans: compassion, community, and care for those who have sacrificed for our country." He went on to explain that the medics were there to conduct free health screenings for veterans and their families, with a special focus on respiratory conditions like Lily's. "No child should ever have to worry about access to the medical care they need," he said, his voice carrying across the park. "And no veteran should have to fight battles at home after fighting for our freedom abroad." As Captain Reynolds spoke, I noticed Margaret standing at the edge of the crowd, her face pale, her perfectly styled hair whipping in the breeze from the helicopters. She looked small and insignificant against the backdrop of military might and community unity. When Captain Reynolds finished speaking, he invited me to say a few words. I kept my remarks brief, thanking the military, the veterans organizations, and most importantly, our neighbors who had rallied behind us. "This isn't just about my daughter or me," I said. "It's about standing up for what's right, about treating everyone with dignity and respect, about building a community that values people over property values." As I spoke, I watched Margaret out of the corner of my eye. She swayed slightly, her hand reaching for her throat. When I mentioned that the event was also a fundraiser for a new community health clinic that would provide free care to residents regardless of their ability to pay, Margaret's eyes rolled back in her head, and she collapsed in a dead faint. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman who had cut my daughter's oxygen tube, who had put property values above people's health and well-being, had fainted at the sight of real compassion in action. As medics rushed to help her, ironically from the very helicopter she had complained about as a nuisance, the crowd erupted in applause and cheers. In the weeks that followed, Margaret resigned from the HOA board, along with 2 of her supporters. New elections were held, and a more diverse, representative board was elected, one that included Mrs. Garcia, Mr. Patel, and David Chen. The first action of the new board was to revise the community's bylaws to prevent discrimination against residents with medical needs and to increase transparency in financial matters. Lily's health improved dramatically with the new community health clinic providing specialized care. The HOA even installed a permanent oxygen concentrator at